Right now, it's Wednesday. I'm Mike Greenberg. We're in Bristol. And again, we thank you for getting up with us as sports fans as we get through all of this together. And most importantly, to those who are medical professionals and first responders, our show is for you. And we thank you for everything you are doing to keep the rest of us safe and healthy. And we start with Get Up and Go because it's a day filled with really big news. The NBA's Commissioner Adam Silver, in an interview last night, said he doesn't expect to make any decisions on his season until May at the earliest. There's a lot to get to there, and we will with Woj in the middle of this hour. Elsewhere, Dana White, UFC, announcing that Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje will be the new main event for UFC 249. That's April 18th at a still undisclosed location. He also told our Brett Okamoto that he has secured a private island to host future cards after that. To see what that looks like. Elsewhere, golf announcing a revamped schedule for 2020 in light of the official cancellation of the Open Championship. Headlining the new tour calendar is the Masters, now being scheduled for November 12th through the 15th. So hold my calls that weekend. Other dates the PGA Tour announced yesterday. The PGA Championship will stay in San Francisco but move to August. The U.S. Open will stay in the New York City area at Winged Foot but move to September, the week before the Ryder Cup, which is held in Wisconsin. If all of this is possible, it will be a very busy golf calendar this summer and fall. And then our big story, Major League Baseball working on a plan to return as early as May, with all 30 teams playing at stadiums without fans in the greater Phoenix area. Players, coaches, and essential personnel would essentially be sequestered at local hotels and live in relative isolation in order to make all of this work. The man whose story this is, late last night on ESPN.com, is that man, Jeff Passan, our baseball insider. It's an extraordinarily detailed story. Jeff, for those who are waking up and haven't read it yet, what are the most important points here that we need to know as they try to work towards the beginning of a baseball season?
I think the most important point, Greeny, is that right now this is a plan. And it is a plan that is going to be extraordinarily difficult to pull off because of all of the logistics, because of getting everybody on board with it, because it requires so many things going right in order for it to happen. And those typically are not the sorts of plans and plots that you see, say, in heist movies or something along those lines. You don't see those applied to sports leagues trying to come back. But here we are. They recognize at Major League Baseball and among the player population that if this plan doesn't work, the likelihood of baseball coming back in 2020 is far less. And so what they're doing is laying things out right now to essentially put themselves inside of a biosphere in the Phoenix area, which would keep them away from the public and ensure that any health problems do not spread there. And hopefully once they're inside of it, provide the sanctity of it so that nobody inside gets hurt either.
So to be clear, for those who haven't seen it, we're talking about essentially the concept of the bubble city, as we've heard repeatedly from the Chinese Basketball Association. They would put everyone inside of that area and keep them there. The players would be away from their families, in theory, for as long as 4 or 5 months if it really did go the entire distance. And then they'd play the games with no fans in the stands. This is what we're looking at. They have enough stadiums in that area because of spring training that they could essentially carry out everything, certainly as far from normal as one could imagine, but you could get in the majority of the games.
Yeah, and listen, that's the hope and that's the plan at this point. But we are in like the nascent stages right now, Greeny. This is just the beginning. And for the last few weeks, Major League Baseball and top officials there have been talking with officials at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institute of Health. This is not some sort of like willy-nilly plan that they're throwing out there. This is something that the scientists are saying, yes, in theory, something like this could work. And because they have the backing of some in the medical community at this point, it's really emboldened baseball to start taking steps forward and looking at those logistics and trying to sell to the players who also have talked with health officials the idea that this is something that would work. But you're right. This could blow up really quickly if the players decide they do not want to isolate from their families for months potentially at a time. And so we're at a really interesting point this week as the players in MLB talk about this plan and about its viability.
Listen, far be it from me to be telling any players what they should or shouldn't do with regard to their own health and safety. That obviously is for them. But if this were to come down to a scenario, and we're probably a long way from that right now, but Jeff, if this came down to a scenario where the players were told, either we try this or there will be no baseball in 2020, which means none of the players get paid in 2020, what is your sense of how that would go?
Let's put it this way, Greedy. I had this exact conversation. There's some players around the league who I sort of use as litmus tests for theories. And something like this had been percolating around. And so I asked a player a couple days ago, hey, if you have to go into a bubble city and you are separated from your family for an indeterminate amount of time, and this is a player who has a wife and kids, is that something that's going to work for you? And his initial response was, no effing way. Yesterday afternoon, I get a text from the same player. It says, talked with my wife, and she said, if the only way that I get paid this year is by having to go into the bubble, here I come, bubble. and I think, there are players out there who are not going to feel that way. And Buster Olney on Twitter this morning made a great point about that. How do you deal with the players who will simply refuse to go into the city? Well, that's something that we may be answering in the coming weeks. One of 1,000 questions and roadblocks in the way of this plan getting off the ground, and yet the right people right now to make it happen are behind it, and that's the most important part in these early stages.
Right, I'm thinking about players who may have compromised immune systems for any number of reasons that might exist, and all these other things. So clearly, sure. There are.
Greedy, can I give you a very quick example here of something that Mike Trout's wife is pregnant and due in August. What do you do if you're him?
Right.
Do you leave the biosphere and then when you come back, you've got to quarantine again for 2 weeks? Which do they let you back? I mean, there are so many questions about this plan where it feels like it can fall apart. And yet it's their option right now, and it's what they have to make work. So we're going to see just how creative MLB and the players can be in what is essentially one giant riddle to solve, with thing after thing after thing that's going to crop up. And they have to understand there are going to be mistakes made here if this thing works. What you hope is that the mistakes don't lead ultimately to COVID-19 spreading among a population that doesn't just include players, remember, but includes managers. Joe Madden in his 70s. That includes older coaches, umpires. All of these people are going to be in the bubble, and they need to be protected as well.
Yeah, a couple of quick other things, and we'll have you with us a little later this morning and go through them, because there are any number of places where this thing could fall apart. We all understand that. But just as far as infrastructure, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering. I mean, in Phoenix, in that area, in June and July, if anyone is watching who lives there or has ever been there, we're talking about some pretty significant heat.
Not great.
How many of the potential stadiums have indoor capability? I know of at least one. Is that it? Is it just the one?
Yeah, but those games might be played in open air just because of the idea of trapping things in a dome. Now, granted, the whole premise of this is that the people who are going to be involved in these games are going to have been in the biosphere, so they're not going to be carrying the coronavirus. But yeah, it's Chase Field downtown where the Diamondbacks play, and you can get into maybe 3 games a day there, but there are 10 spring training complexes around the area. There's also Phoenix Municipal Stadium, which used to be the spring home of the A's, and now Arizona State plays there. There are options, but the heat is a realistic thing, Greeny, and it's part of the reason, in addition to trying to make sure that if a small potential outbreak does happen, you have enough players, that both sides agree there are going to need to be significantly expanded rosters to make this happen. You know, there may be 40 or 50 players on a roster available at one time for teams to go out and get, not just because you could lose some players if an outbreak does happen, but because guys are just going to be tired from playing in the 100-degree heat. I will say this, though. Every fall, half the teams in baseball send out an Arizona League team full of 18 and 19-year-olds to play in the Phoenix Heat. Those games are at night, and I think that's something that could happen. You can have games at night for the West Coast teams. You could have games earlier in the day, maybe, you know, afternoon games for the East Coast teams.
All right, listen, I'm sure that many people who've not read it yet have a lot of questions. Many of them are answered in the piece. I recommend you go to ESPN.com or Jeff's Twitter page and you read all of it because there's a lot of answers, as many as there exist right now. Clearly, this is a situation that is fluid, to say the least. Jeff, great work. I need to go here, but we'll bring you back a little bit later in this hour and we'll talk further as we go. It's Jeff Passan, our baseball insider, with an extraordinary story. I want to get some players in here. And again, I've got two football players with me right now. We'll have Alex Rodriguez a little later this morning, but you see Ryan Clark and Dominique Foxworth. And I just want to ask both of you guys, Nick, I'll start with you. If we were to see a situation right now, again, because this is baseball, but let's just put ourselves in a world where football faces this as well, where your option is miss a season and not get paid for a year, or go into a bubble away from your wife and your children and everything else for 4 months. What do you think you would do, and what do you think most football players would do?
Football players, I think, are a lot more comfortable with a level of risk than most sports and most people, frankly. So I think that most players would be willing to go do that. I absolutely would have gone and done it, especially if I was in my second contract. That's money that you'll never get back. That frankly is meant to set up your life and set up your kids' kids. So it's a risk that you would take for just a few months. I think the people around the organization who aren't necessarily players or coaches who aren't making the big money, those people might have a harder decision to make because this is not what they signed up for by any stretch. And I do think it's important to point out that this baseball experiment, if it's something that they do try, everyone needs it to succeed, because if they go into that bubble and it fails, there goes the football season. No other team, or excuse me, no other league is going to try this if baseball tries it and it fails.
How about you, RC? And obviously yours is a situation, it's well documented, some of the issues that you have from a health standpoint after what happened in Denver. So you might have a little different perspective on this, but I'm just curious, as you heard the conversation with Jeff,